Whole Foods thinks they invented fermented foods. They're off by about 200 years. Viking warriors were preserving fish in underground pits that stayed edible for months. Norse mothers were culturing dairy products that would make modern probiotics look amateur. Arctic communities were fermenting shark meat so potent it could sustain life through 6-month winters. So tonight we're going back to discover how Vikings really survived without refrigeration. And I promise you, these slow stories of Norse preservation are perfect for drifting off to sleep. If this kind of slow Viking food history helps you unwind and fall asleep, feel free to like and subscribe, and let me know where you're listening from. It's always comforting to know who else is out there falling asleep to these same quiet stories of Norse survival. Now, let's slow down and really explore this boring, peaceful world. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's travel back to Viking Age Scandinavia, where the gentle rhythm of food preservation created the foundation for survival in the harshest climate on Earth. Close your eyes if you'd like, settle in, and let's drift back to 9th century Norway, where the air carries the sharp scent of fermenting fish and wood smoke, where Norse families move with the quiet confidence of people who understand that winter is not an enemy to fear, but a season to prepare for with patience and ancient knowledge. You're standing in a longhouse, watching smoke curl peacefully up through the roof opening. The walls are thick turf and timber, holding back the autumn cold. Around you, the soft sounds of preservation, the gentle scraping of knives against wood, the quiet murmur of women discussing fermentation times, the peaceful rhythm of salt being rubbed into fish flesh. This is Viking food preservation. Not the dramatic raids you've seen in movies. Not the violence of conquest. Just the slow, methodical, deeply boring work of ensuring your family survives until spring. And tonight, we're going to explore every quiet detail of how they did it, one peaceful step at a time. You slowly walk through a Norse settlement in late September, when the air grows crisp, and the first hints of winter whisper through the birch trees. You don't rush, you don't worry. You just watch as families begin their quiet, ancient dance with preservation. The autumn harvest is in. Barley and oats rest in storage pits lined with birch bark. Root vegetables nestle in cool earth cellars. But it's the preservation of protein that demands your gentle attention now, because protein is what will keep bodies warm through the endless dark months ahead. You peacefully observe a grandmother teaching her granddaughter the art of selecting fish for preservation. Not any fish will do. The fat content matters, the size matters. The timing of the catch matters in ways that modern refrigeration has let us forget. She runs her weathered fingers along a cod's belly, feeling the firmness, assessing the oil content with touch alone. Too lean, she murmurs softly, will dry to nothing. Too fat spoils before the salt can work its magic. This knowledge isn't written anywhere. It lives in hands that have touched thousands of fish and eyes that have watched fermentation for decades, in the quiet confidence of women who understand that their family's survival depends on these gentle decisions made in autumn sunlight. You watch as they lay out the selected fish on smooth stones, their movements unhurried and contemplative. There's a meditation in this work. Each fish is slit with precision, cleaned with care, prepared with the kind of attention that comes only from understanding consequences. One fish improperly prepared means one meal missing in February. One batch allowed to spoil means children going hungry when the snow lies 10 feet deep. The men are digging preservation pits now, their shovels moving in steady rhythm. Not too deep, where water might seep in. Not too shallow, where winter freeze might penetrate. Just right. And just right is knowledge passed down through generations measured not in inches, but in the length of a man's arm. The depth of last winter's frost line. The wisdom of grandmothers who remember the winter of no food. Sometimes you hear soft singing as they work. Old songs about harvests and survival, sung in voices that don't perform but simply accompany the rhythm of labor. The melody is simple, repetitive, designed to make hours of work pass peacefully. You find yourself breathing in time with the song, your shoulders relaxing, your mind drifting along with the ancient tune. The preservation process is beginning. Salt is being measured. Precious salt traded from distant lands, carried in leather pouches, valued more than silver because salt means survival. You watch a woman's hands move with practiced precision, spreading salt crystals across fish flesh, in layers so thin, and even it looks like snow falling in slow motion. Not too much, which would make the fish inedible. Not too little, which would allow decay. Just enough, a measurement that exists only in muscle memory and experience. The children are helping, their small hands learning the motions. A boy of perhaps 8 carefully layers fish in a wooden barrel, following his mother's quiet instructions. Skin side up, child. Always skin side up. See how the salt settles in the flesh. See how it draws the water out, gentle and slow. The boy nods, his movements becoming more confident as the pattern repeats. This is education without books, knowledge transfer without writing, the preservation of culture happening alongside the preservation of food. You notice the temperature matters greatly. Too warm, and the fish might spoil before the salt can work. Too cold, and the salt won't penetrate properly. They're working in the cool autumn air, timing this ancient process with the season's natural refrigeration. The Norse didn't control temperature. They collaborated with it, working with nature's rhythms rather than against them. As evening approaches, you watch families gather around fires to continue their work by flickering light. There's something deeply peaceful about this scene. The orange glow on weathered faces, the steady movement of hands, the soft conversations that flow like water over stones. They're not stressed, they're not rushed. This is simply what September means in the north. This is the quiet price of surviving winter. The fish are going into barrels now, packed in salt and their own brine, sealed with wooden lids weighted with stones. These barrels will sit in cool storage until midwinter, the fish slowly transforming from fresh meat into something else entirely. Something that can sustain life when nothing else exists. The transformation is chemical, bacterial, ancient. The Norse don't understand the science, but they understand the result with perfect clarity. You settle into the rhythm of watching this work, feeling your breathing slow to match the peaceful pace. There's no urgency here, no deadlines except the ones nature provides. Just the slow, competent movement of people who know exactly what they're doing, who have done this every autumn, for as long as anyone can remember, who will do it every autumn for as long as the family line continues. Minutos 2030. As you drift deeper into this autumn evening, watching families work together in the gathering darkness, you understand something profound. Survival isn't dramatic. It's not violent or exciting. Survival is this: quiet preparation, patient work, knowledge passed through generations, hands moving in patterns as old as the settlement itself. And somewhere in the peaceful repetition of salt and fish and barrel, somewhere in the gentle confidence of these Norse families, you find yourself relaxing completely into this ancient rhythm of preparation. You peacefully observe the science that Vikings practiced without understanding its microbiology. Fermentation, the controlled decay that preserves rather than destroys, that transforms rather than ruins, that creates nutrition in the absence of fresh food. The morning is cool and still as you watch a woman check her fermentation crocks. These are not the neat glass jars of modern fermentation. These are wooden barrels, stone crocks, leather bags sealed with animal fat. The containers themselves are works of art. Cooperage so precise that liquids remain sealed for months. Staves so carefully fitted that no air enters to spoil the contents. She lifts the stone weight from a barrel of fermenting cabbage, and the scent that rises is sharp and alive. Not rotten, but transformed. You watch her face as she smells it, sees her eyes close in satisfaction. Good, she murmurs to herself. The spirits are working properly. She doesn't know about lactobacillus bacteria. She doesn't understand pH levels or anaerobic environments. But she knows good fermentation from bad with the certainty that comes from a lifetime of practice. You lean closer, observing the surface of the fermentation. There's a thin layer of white, calm yeast, though she would never call it that. She skims it off peacefully with a wooden spoon, her movements economical and sure. This is daily maintenance, a quiet task repeated throughout the long fermentation period, as natural as checking that a fire hasn't gone out. Nearby, another woman is preparing skyr, the cultured dairy product that sustained Norse peoples through winters when fresh milk ceased to flow. You watch her heat milk slowly over a low fire, testing the temperature with her finger in a way that would horrify modern food safety inspectors, but works perfectly in her experienced hands. When it reaches that precise point, warm but not hot, body temperature or just above, she adds the starter culture from yesterday's skyr. The transformation begins immediately, though you can't see it. Bacteria are colonizing the warm milk, consuming lactose, producing lactic acid, changing the structure of proteins in ways that will both preserve the dairy and make it digestible for people whose ancestors had no business processing milk into adulthood. But evolution and culture work together here, creating lactose tolerance in northern populations and culturing techniques that made dairy safe and nutritious. You settle onto a bench, watching this woman work with the kind of attention that reveals patterns. She's not measuring anything. No cups, no scales, no thermometers. Just hands that know the feel of milk at the right temperature, eyes that recognize the proper consistency of starter culture, a mind that tracks fermentation time with the same accuracy that modern timers provide. Her grandmother taught her. Her grandmother's grandmother taught that grandmother. The knowledge flows backward through centuries of Norse women keeping their families alive with controlled bacterial growth. The skyr will ferment overnight in its covered vessel, the bacteria working their slow magic in the darkness. By morning, it will have thickened, soured, transformed into something that can last for weeks or months in a cool storage area, providing protein and probiotics through the long winter. You find yourself breathing deeply, peacefully, thinking about the miracle of this transformation that happens not through heat or effort, but through patience and microbial collaboration. Across the settlement, you observe fish being prepared for a different kind of fermentation. This isn't the quick pickling of vegetables. This is rackfisk, fermented trout that will age for months, developing flavors so intense that modern Norwegians consider it an acquired taste, and foreigners often find it overwhelming. But in winter, when stored correctly, this fermented fish provides not just protein but essential nutrients that prevent scurvy and malnutrition. You watch an older man teaching a young apprentice the art of rakefisk preparation. The fish must be fresh, he explains in a low, patient voice. Caught yesterday, no longer. Clean them gently. We're not removing all the bacteria, just the viscera. The bacteria is what does the work, child. Too clean and nothing happens. Not clean enough and it becomes poison instead of food. The fish are going into a brine so carefully calibrated, it might as well be a chemical formula. Salt concentration matters enormously. Too much and fermentation stops. Too little and pathogenic bacteria outcompete the beneficial ones. The Norse achieved this balance through empirical testing over generations, adjusting salt levels based on water source, fish species, storage temperature, until they found the sweet spot where preservation happened safely. You notice the fermentation vessels are being buried in the ground, not to hide them, but to maintain consistent cool temperatures. Underground, insulated by earth, the temperature remains stable even as surface conditions fluctuate. The fish will ferment slowly in this cool darkness, bacterial populations rising and falling in careful succession, proteins breaking down into amino acids, creating that characteristic umami richness that makes fermented fish so nutritionally dense. The process takes months, 3 months, 6 months, sometimes longer for the most prized preparations. You can't see the fermentation happening. It's invisible, microbial, chemical. But the results are spectacular. Fish that won't spoil for a year or more, that provides complete protein through the harshest conditions, that tastes powerfully of the sea and survival. As afternoon light slants through the longhouse door, you watch families checking their various fermentation projects with the casual expertise of people who maintain these processes year-round. A barrel of fermenting beets, a crock of cultured butter, bags of soured milk hanging from the rafters, slowly dripping way into collection vessels below. Each fermentation is its own small ecosystem, billions of bacteria working in darkness, transforming food from perishable to preserved. You find yourself mesmerized by the patience this requires. No instant gratification here. No quick results. Just the slow faith that if you prepare things correctly and wait with patience, beneficial bacteria will do their work. And on the other side of that waiting period stands survival. The Norse relationship with fermentation is one of trust. Trust in invisible processes, trust in traditional methods, trust that what worked for their ancestors will work for them. As evening approaches, the settlement smells of fermentation. The sharp tang of cultured dairy, the pungent aroma of fish in brine, the earthy scent of fermenting vegetables. It's not unpleasant, this smell. It's the smell of food being actively preserved, of bacterial action that means survival rather than decay. You breathe it in, feeling yourself relax into the ancient certainty of these processes. You peacefully observe the most fundamental preservation method humans ever discovered: the simple removal of water. Drying, desiccation, the slow transformation of perishable food into something that can last for years if stored properly. The morning air is crisp as you watch families hanging fish on enormous wooden racks that tower against the autumn sky. These aren't modern drying racks with precise spacing and controlled airflow. These are rough-hewn timber structures, built and rebuilt every generation, placed in locations chosen through centuries of observation, where wind flows consistently, but not violently, where rain rarely reaches but air circulation remains constant, where sun exposure is optimal for drying without cooking. You settle into watching this work, feeling your breathing slow to match the unhurried pace. A man is selecting fish for drying, his hands moving with practiced certainty. Size matters. Too large and the center won't dry before the outside spoils. Too small and there's barely any meat worth the effort. Species matters. Fatty fish dry differently than lean ones. Some develop better flavor, others better texture. He's making these determinations with the kind of automatic expertise that looks effortless, but represents decades of experience. The fish are being butterflied open, their spines remaining intact to provide structure during the drying process. You watch weathered hands work with knives that have been sharpened 10,000 times, creating cuts so precise and consistent they could have been done by machine. But there's no machine here, just human hands, sharp steel, and the muscle memory of doing this same task every autumn since childhood. Menudos 50 or 60. Now they're hanging the fish on the racks, draping them over horizontal poles in rows that will eventually cover the entire structure. The spacing is critical. Too close, and airflow is restricted. Too far apart, and the rack space is wasted. They gauge this spacing not with measurements but with experience, hanging each fish at a distance that looks random, but represents generations of optimization. You notice the racks are positioned to face the prevailing wind. This isn't accidental. The Norse understood aerodynamics without ever articulating the principle. They knew that consistent airflow prevents the growth of mold and bacteria, that moving air carries away moisture more efficiently than still air, that wind patterns matter more than temperature in successful drying. So they built their racks in locations where sea breezes flow consistently, where coastal winds provide natural food preservation without human effort. The process of drying is meditation. You watch the fish hanging motionless against the sky, barely moving in the gentle breeze. Nothing dramatic happens, there are no sudden transformations, just the slow, peaceful evaporation of water molecules one by one, day after day, until what remains is something entirely different from what began. Days pass in your observation. You check the fish racks in the morning, when dew has settled overnight. You check them at midday, when sun warms the wood and accelerates drying. You check them in evening, when cooling air begins to still. The fish are changing, stiffening, darkening, shrinking as moisture departs. What started as flexible flesh becomes rigid and leathery. What began as recognizable fish slowly transforms into something more abstract. Preserved protein, survival rations, winter sustenance. You watch families maintain the drying racks through weeks of autumn weather. When rain threatens, they cover the racks with oiled leather or move the fish under shelter. When humidity rises, they adjust spacing to improve airflow. When seabirds show interest, they hang deterrents, shiny objects that spin in the wind, creating movement and reflection that keeps the birds at bay. This is not passive preservation. This is active management of an ongoing process, daily maintenance of food that's slowly transforming. Nearby, meat is being dried using similar principles but different techniques. You observe strips of reindeer meat hanging in a smokehouse, where heat and smoke work together to preserve while adding flavor. The smoke is from birch wood, not because birch tastes better, but because birch smoke contains compounds that inhibit bacterial growth while imparting flavors that complement meat. The Norse didn't understand the chemistry of phenols and formaldehyde, but they understood that birch-smoked meat lasted longer and tasted better. The smokehouse is a marvel of simple engineering. You study its construction: walls that allow smoke to rise while preventing rain from entering, vents that can be adjusted to control heat and airflow, hooks and racks positioned at different heights to accommodate different drying speeds. The fire below must be maintained constantly but carefully. Too hot, and the meat cooks rather than dries. Too cool, and the preservation process slows dangerously. An old man tends this fire with the attention of someone maintaining something precious, adding wood in small amounts, adjusting airflow with practiced movements, checking meat regularly to ensure proper progress. You find yourself mesmerized by the simplicity of this preservation method. No complex chemistry, no specialized equipment, just heat, smoke, time, and attention. The meat will hang for weeks, slowly transforming from fresh flesh into jerky that can last for years, becoming lighter, tougher, more concentrated in flavor and nutrition. When winter arrives and fresh meat becomes scarce, these dried strips will provide protein that sustained Norse peoples through the darkest months. As weeks pass, you watch the completion of drying processes all around the settlement. Fish that hung flexible now hang rigid as boards. Meat that was soft and pliable is now leathery and tough. Mushrooms that were once plump caps are now shriveled discs, all of them transformed by the simple removal of water, made imperishable through desiccation. The dried food is being taken down now, sorted and stored in cool, dry spaces. You observe families packing dried fish into barrels, layering them carefully to maximize storage efficiency. The fish are so light now. 100 pounds of fresh fish has become 20 pounds of dried, all the water weight gone, leaving only concentrated nutrition. This is how you store protein through winter without refrigeration. This is how you survive. You settle into evening observations, watching the now empty drying racks stand against the darkening sky. They'll be used again next autumn, and the autumn after that, and the autumn after that. Generation after generation will hang fish on these same structures. We'll check them with the same attention. We'll pack the dried results with the same care. The method doesn't change because the method works perfectly. As you drift deeper into this contemplation of drying, you understand something profound about preservation. The most effective methods are often the simplest. Remove water, and bacteria cannot grow. Remove moisture, and food becomes imperishable. The Norse understood this with perfect clarity, and they built their survival around this simple truth, hanging fish and meat against Nordic skies with the quiet confidence of people who know exactly what they're doing. You peacefully observe the earth itself becoming a preservation tool, as families prepare underground storage that will maintain food through 6 months of winter. These aren't the root cellars of later European agriculture. These are earlier, simpler structures dug directly into permafrost and hillsides, leveraging the natural refrigeration of frozen ground. The morning finds you watching men dig storage pits with careful precision. The location matters enormously. Too close to the longhouse and body heat might warm the storage. Too far away and retrieving food in blizzards becomes dangerous. They're digging into a hillside that faces north, where sun rarely reaches even in summer, where the ground remains frozen deep below the surface year-round. You settle onto a nearby stone, observing the rhythmic work of digging. The soil here is partially frozen even in autumn, making this hard labor. But frozen ground is exactly what they want. Natural refrigeration that requires no maintenance, no energy, no attention beyond initial construction. You watch shovels bite into earth that's somewhere between soil and ice. Hear the grunt of effort as each load is lifted and tossed aside. The pit they're creating is deeper than a man is tall, wide enough to hold dozens of barrels and sacks. The walls are being lined with stones to prevent collapse, fitted together with the kind of casual mastery that comes from building similar structures every year. No mortar. The stones support each other through careful placement and the pressure of surrounding earth. Water-resistant without being waterproof, allowing any moisture to drain away while keeping the contents dry. You notice they're creating different chambers within the single pit, separate spaces for different types of food. Root vegetables in one section, where they can be accessed frequently. Barrels of preserved fish in another, where they'll remain largely undisturbed until needed. Dried goods in a third, elevated section, where moisture is least likely to reach. This isn't random organization. This is systematic storage developed through generations of trial and error, optimized for access patterns and preservation requirements. Now they're preparing the foods for storage. You watch as sacks of grain are being checked one final time. Any moisture? Any sign of insect damage? And that sack doesn't go into long-term storage. The quality control is meticulous because one contaminated sack can spoil an entire chamber. They're looking for the same signs that modern food inspectors check, using the same principles of observation and selection, just without written standards or regulatory frameworks. Root vegetables are being sorted with similar care. Damaged carrots set aside for immediate consumption. Perfect turnips selected for storage. Onions with any sign of rot excluded entirely. You watch weathered hands move through piles of vegetables with practiced efficiency. The sorting happening so quickly it looks automatic. But there's deep knowledge here, understanding which small imperfections will spread during storage, and which are harmless, knowing which vegetables will last until spring and which won't make it past midwinter. The vegetables are going into the pit now, being arranged in layers of sand and earth that will keep them from touching each other, prevent moisture accumulation, maintain consistent temperature. You observe the layering technique. A bed of sand, a layer of root vegetables with space between each one, another layer of sand, more vegetables, continuing upward until the chamber is full. Each vegetable is essentially buried individually, insulated from its neighbors, protected from both freezing and decay. You find yourself breathing slowly, peacefully, watching this methodical work. There's something deeply satisfying about observing food being stored so carefully, each item given individual attention, each layer built with thought about the months ahead. This is survival planning made visible, not hoarding or anxiety, but thoughtful preparation for known challenges. Barrels of preserved fish are being lowered into deeper chambers now. These barrels will remain undisturbed for months, the fish fermenting slowly in their brine, developing flavors and nutritional complexity. The cool underground temperature, just above freezing but never quite reaching it, is perfect for slow fermentation. Too warm and the fish might spoil. Properly cool and beneficial bacteria work their magic safely. You notice the storage pit has drainage built in, slight slopes that direct any moisture toward channels that lead away from the food stores. The Norse understood that water is the enemy of storage, that even in frozen ground, moisture can accumulate and spoil food. So they engineered drainage without understanding fluid dynamics, created waterproofing without modern materials, built structures that self-manage moisture through simple gravitational principles. As the pit fills with food, you watch the construction of its covering. First, wooden planks to create a roof structure, then layers of turf to insulate and waterproof. Finally, stones on top to prevent animals from digging through. The covering is substantial, thick enough to provide serious insulation, heavy enough to deter predators, designed to withstand the weight of winter snow that might accumulate 10 feet deep. The entrance is being carefully designed, small enough to minimize heat loss when opened, positioned where snow won't block it completely, fitted with a door that can be secured against animals and weather. You observe an older man teaching a younger one how to hang the door properly, explaining in patient tones how the hinges must allow movement even when ice forms, how the seal must be tight, but not so tight that it can't be opened in emergency. Now the storage is complete. You stand looking at what appears to be just a mound in the hillside. Nothing dramatic, nothing impressive to modern eyes. But this simple structure represents months of survival. Inside this earth-insulated space rests enough food to sustain a family through winter's worst, preserved through techniques so effective they barely need checking, stored in conditions so stable they might as well be refrigeration. You watch a grandmother stand beside the finished storage pit, her weathered face showing quiet satisfaction. She's supervised the construction, applied decades of knowledge to every decision, ensured that this year's food will be as safely stored as last year's and the year before. There's no pride in her expression, just the peaceful confidence of having completed necessary work competently. As evening approaches, you observe families marking their storage pits with simple cairns and markers, making them identifiable even under deep snow. These markers aren't just practical, they're also territorial, quietly indicating which families own which stores, maintaining social order through simple visual cues. The settlement's food security is now established, stored beneath the earth, protected by permafrost and careful preparation. You settle into evening contemplation, thinking about the genius of using Earth itself as technology. No power required, no maintenance needed. Just the eternal cold of northern ground providing refrigeration that never fails, insulation that never degrades, storage that works as well in the 9th century as it would in the 21st. The Norse didn't invent underground storage. Humans had been doing it for millennia. But they perfected it for their particular climate and needs, creating systems so reliable that families trusted them with their survival. You peacefully observe the oldest preservation technology humanity ever developed, the deliberate application of smoke to food, creating flavors while preventing decay. The smoking process is beginning now, in the cool days of late autumn, and you settle in to watch this ancient craft unfold with meditative slowness. The smokehouse stands at the edge of the settlement, positioned downwind from living quarters so smoke doesn't make the longhouses unbearable. You study its construction with quiet attention, rough-hewn timbers forming walls that are neither sealed nor completely open, allowing smoke to circulate while preventing rain from entering. The roof is turf-covered, the floor is stone, and inside, dozens of hooks and racks wait to receive meat and fish. A fire is being built now, but not the kind of fire you'd use for cooking or warmth. You watch experienced hands select wood with careful precision, birch exclusively, with some juniper for flavor. The wood has been aged specifically for smoking, dried but not completely, achieving that perfect moisture content where it smolders steadily without bursting into flame. Too dry and it burns too hot. Too wet and it produces steam instead of smoke. The fire builder arranges the wood in a careful pattern, creating a structure that will burn slowly and consistently for hours. You observe how he creates airflow channels, how he positions larger pieces to support smaller ones, how he calculates the burn rate based on wood size and arrangement. This isn't just fire building. This is engineering, done with wood and experience rather than blueprints and mathematics. The fire catches, and soon smoke begins to rise. Not the black smoke of burning, but the white-gray smoke of smoldering. You watch it curl upward through the smokehouse, see it begin to accumulate around the meat and fish hanging from the rafters. The scent is incredible, woody and clean, with undertones of the juniper branches scattered through the fire, a smell that immediately makes you think of preservation and winter preparation. You settle onto a bench outside the smokehouse, watching through the open door as the smoking process begins in earnest. Fish hang in rows, their flesh slowly taking on the golden brown color that indicates proper smoking. The smoke is coating every surface, penetrating the meat, depositing compounds that will inhibit bacterial growth while adding flavor. The Norse don't know about phenols and formaldehyde, don't understand the chemistry of smoke preservation, but they know with perfect certainty that properly smoked fish will last for months. Hours pass in quiet observation. The fire needs constant attention, Not moment-by-moment monitoring, but regular checking to ensure the smoke production remains consistent. You watch the fire tender add wood periodically, always small amounts, always positioned to maintain the smolder without creating flame. He checks the smoke color and density, adjusts airflow by opening or closing vents, makes tiny corrections that keep the process optimal. The temperature inside the smokehouse is critical. You observe how they maintain the delicate balance, warm enough that some cooking occurs and moisture is driven out, cool enough that the meat doesn't cook completely. This is cold smoking, not hot smoking, a process that takes days rather than hours, that preserves while adding flavor, that creates food that can last through an entire winter without refrigeration. You notice different types of meat hanging at different heights. Beef higher where it's cooler and can dry slowly, fish lower where more heat accelerates the process. Sausages in the middle where temperature is just right for their particular requirements. This height-based temperature management shows sophisticated understanding of heat distribution and smoking requirements, knowledge that was never written down, but was passed from generation to generation through demonstration and practice. As afternoon light filters through the smoke-filled air, you watch a master smoker teaching an apprentice the subtle signs of proper smoking. "See how the flesh darkens," he explains in a low, patient voice. "Too light, and the smoke hasn't penetrated enough. Too dark, and you've cooked it rather than preserved it. The color tells you everything. You just have to learn to read it." The apprentice nods, his eyes studying the meat with new attention, beginning to see what experience makes obvious. This is education through observation and repetition, the ancient method of knowledge transfer that served humanity for millennia before written instruction existed. You find yourself relaxing into this scene, appreciating the patience of teaching and learning, the calm transmission of critical survival skills. Days pass in your observation. The smoking continues day and night, the fire never allowed to go out, the smoke production maintained at consistent levels. You watch different family members take turns tending the fire. This is communal work, too important to leave to a single person, requiring around-the-clock attention that gets shared among those with the knowledge to do it properly. The meat is transforming. What started as flexible flesh is becoming firm and dry. The exterior is developing a pellicle, that shiny, slightly tacky surface that indicates proteins have been properly denatured and preserved. The color has deepened to rich browns and golds, the surface taking on an almost lacquered appearance that speaks to thorough smoke penetration. You observe the testing process that determines when smoking is complete. An elder woman removes a piece of fish from the smokehouse, examines it in good light, feels its texture with experienced fingers, smells it deeply, even tears off a small piece to taste. She nods slowly. Another day, she decides. The center is still too soft. The fish goes back onto its hook, and the smoking continues. This empirical testing is the only quality control available, but it's remarkably effective. These experienced smokers can determine internal moisture content by external appearance, can judge preservation completeness through texture and smell, can predict storage life based on subtle indicators that modern food scientists would measure with instruments. Their tools are human senses, honed by necessity and experience. More days pass. The settlement smells perpetually of wood smoke now, a scent that will cling to everything: clothing, hair, skin, throughout the smoking season. You find yourself enjoying this smell, finding it comforting rather than overwhelming, associating it with preparation and security rather than discomfort. Finally, the first batch is declared ready. You watch as meat and fish are removed from the smokehouse, inspected one final time, then packed away for storage. The meat is rigid now, the moisture content reduced to levels where bacteria cannot thrive. The fish have become golden artifacts, more artwork than food in appearance, but containing concentrated nutrition that will sustain life through winter. The smokehouse will continue operating throughout autumn, processing batch after batch of meat and fish, filling storage areas with preserved protein. This is industrial-scale food preservation done with the most basic technology, Fire, wood, time, and knowledge. No refrigeration, no chemical preservatives, no modern conveniences. Just smoke and patience creating food security. You watch fresh meat being hung for the next batch, the process beginning again with the same careful attention. The cycle is meditative. Hang meat, tend fire, monitor smoke, test readiness, remove finished product, hang fresh meat, repeat. There's something deeply satisfying about this rhythm, this repetitive but essential work that connects directly to survival. As evening approaches, you observe families gathering to distribute the smoked food, allocating portions based on family size and need. The distribution is fair, but not equal. Larger families receive more. Elderly living alone receive enough for their smaller households. Everyone receives sufficient for their particular situation. This communal approach to food security ensures survival isn't a competition, but a shared responsibility. You settle into nighttime observation, watching the smokehouse glow from within, its walls outlining themselves in firelight, smoke rising peacefully into the dark sky. The fire tender sits nearby, occasionally adding wood, mostly just watching and waiting. There's a timeless quality to this scene. This could be any century, any generation, any autumn in Norse history. The technology doesn't change because the technology works perfectly. As you drift deeper into contemplation of smoking and preservation, you understand something about the Norse relationship with food. It was never taken for granted. Every meal in winter represented someone's labor in autumn, someone's knowledge and skill, someone's attention to the ancient crafts of preservation. The respect for food wasn't philosophical or spiritual. It was deeply practical, rooted in understanding exactly how much work stood between them and starvation. You peacefully observe the most precious preservation tool in the Norse world, salt, valued more than silver because salt meant the difference between survival and starvation. The autumn air is crisp as you watch families prepare their most important preservation project, the salting of meat and fish for winter storage. You settle onto a smooth stone, observing as barrels of salt are brought out from storage areas where they've been kept dry and precious throughout the year. This salt traveled far to reach this settlement, traded from distant coastlines where seawater evaporates in salt pans, carried by merchants who understand its value, purchased at prices that make families calculate carefully how much they can afford. A grandmother is measuring salt with movements so practiced they look ritualistic. Her hands move in and out of the barrel, scooping precise amounts that she's measured 1,000 times before without ever using a scale. Too little salt, and the meat will spoil before winter ends. Too much, and the food becomes inedibly bitter, wasting both salt and meat. The balance must be perfect, and in her weathered hands it always is. You watch as she begins the salting process with fresh fish brought in from the morning's catch. Each fish is cleaned with care, butterflied open to expose maximum flesh surface, then laid flat on a wooden table worn smooth by decades of this same work. She takes a handful of salt. You notice her hand has learned the exact amount through repetition and begins rubbing it into the flesh with firm, even pressure. The motion is meditative. You find yourself breathing in rhythm with her hands as they work the salt into every crevice of the fish, ensuring complete coverage, leaving no spot untouched where decay might begin. The salt begins drawing moisture immediately, pulling water from the flesh through osmosis, creating a brine that will itself become part of the preservation process. Nearby, a younger woman is learning this craft, mimicking the elders' movements with careful attention. Feel how the flesh changes? The grandmother asks softly. The salt draws the water out, makes the flesh firmer. When it stops feeling slippery and starts feeling compact, that's when you know the first layer is working. The young woman nods, her hands continuing their work, learning through touch what cannot be easily explained in words. This is education through sensation and repetition, knowledge that lives in muscles and fingertips, rather than in written instructions. You observe as the salted fish are being layered in barrels specifically prepared for this purpose. The barrels themselves are cooperative masterpieces, staves so tightly fitted that brine won't leak through, yet with enough flex that they won't crack as contents expand and contract with temperature changes. Each barrel represents days of skilled carpentry, another technology essential to preservation. The layering technique is precise. First, a bed of salt on the barrel bottom, then a layer of fish, skin side down, then more salt, completely covering the first layer. Another layer of fish, oriented differently to maximize space efficiency. More salt. The pattern repeats until the barrel is full, each layer receiving the exact amount of salt needed to preserve without waste. You watch as the grandmother supervises this layering, occasionally adjusting a fish position, adding a bit more salt here, redistributing it there. Her corrections are small but important. This is the difference between successful preservation and spoiled food, between family-fed and family-hungry. Now they're preparing the brine that will fill the barrel. You observe as seawater is being boiled with additional salt, creating a supersaturated solution. The concentration must be perfect, strong enough to prevent bacterial growth, not so strong that it draws every bit of moisture from the fish and makes them inedibly dry. They test the concentration using an old method, a fresh egg. If it floats with just the top breaking the surface, the brine is ready. If it sinks, more salt is needed. If it bobs too high, the solution is too strong. This floating egg test is ingenious, using density as a measurement tool without understanding the physics involved, achieving precise results through observation and traditional knowledge. The egg floats at exactly the right level, and the grandmother nods with satisfaction. "Good," she murmurs. "This brine will hold through winter." The cooled brine is being poured into the barrel now, filling the spaces between fish layers, surrounding each piece with liquid that will protect against oxidation and decay. You watch the brine level rise slowly, see it fill every gap. Notice how it's weighted down with a wooden disc and heavy stone to keep all fish fully submerged. Exposure to air is the enemy. Anything that breaks the surface can spoil, compromising the entire barrel. You find yourself mesmerized by the completeness of this preservation system. The salt draws out moisture that bacteria need to grow. The brine creates an environment too salty for pathogens to survive. The submersion prevents oxidation and air-based contamination. The cool storage temperature slows any remaining microbial activity. Together, these factors create a preservation environment so effective that fish packed this way can last for years. Nearby, meat is receiving similar treatment but with variations suited to its different structure. You observe large cuts of pork being dry salted. No brine, just salt packed directly against the meat, drawing out moisture while creating an environment hostile to decay. The salt is being rubbed in with force, physically working it into the meat tissue, ensuring penetration through tough muscle and fat. The cuts are substantial. Whole hams, large shoulders, sections of belly. These will hang in the salt for weeks, buried in crystalline white granules, slowly transforming from fresh meat into preserved provisions. You watch as they're arranged in a wooden trough, each piece thoroughly coated, salt piled over and around them until they're completely buried. The trough will sit in cool storage, and periodically someone will check it, redistribute the salt that has liquefied as it drew moisture from the meat, add fresh salt where needed. This dry salting technique produces a different result than brine preservation. Drier, firmer, more intensely flavored. The meat that emerges after weeks in salt will need soaking before use, rehydrating in fresh water to make it palatable. But properly dry salted, this meat can last for years, transported anywhere, surviving conditions that would spoil fresh meat in hours. You observe the careful calculation happening as families decide what to salt and how much salt to use. Every piece of meat represents food they won't have fresh. Every handful of salt represents expense and resource allocation. The decisions aren't emotional, they're mathematical, based on family size, expected winter length, alternative food sources, and precious salt supply. An elder man is mixing salt with other preservatives now. Juniper berries, crushed and added to the salt mixture. The berries contain antimicrobial compounds that enhance preservation while adding flavor. He doesn't know the chemistry, doesn't know about the essential oils and their antibacterial properties, But he knows with certainty that meat preserved with juniper salt lasts longer and tastes better than meat preserved with salt alone. You watch him work the berry salt mixture with his hands, crushing berries to release their oils, mixing until the salt is evenly colored and scented. This mixture will be used for the most prized cuts of meat, the ones intended for special occasions, the ones that will be stored longest. The juniper makes it special, transforms simple salt preservation into something more refined. As afternoon wears on, you observe multiple families engaged in the same work: salting, brining, packing barrels, hanging meat. The settlement has transformed into a preservation factory, everyone focused on the same essential task. The work is repetitive but not monotonous, important enough that attention never wanders, meaningful enough that even children help seriously. You notice the salt itself is being treated with respect that borders on reverence. Spilled salt is carefully swept up and reused. Empty salt barrels are scraped clean to recover every crystal. This isn't superstition, it's economic necessity. Salt is expensive, salt is essential, and waste isn't acceptable when survival depends on careful resource management. The brine barrels are being sealed now, their lids fitted tightly, the seals checked to ensure no air enters, no brine leaks out. These barrels will sit in cool storage until winter demands their contents. The fish inside will continue their transformation. The salt will continue its work, the brine will prevent decay, and when a barrel is finally opened months from now, the fish inside will be perfectly preserved, ready to nourish, rather than nourish bacteria. You watch as the sealed barrels are rolled carefully into storage areas, positioned where temperature remains consistently cool, marked so families know which barrel contains which preservation batch. The organization is methodical, not because they have formal inventory systems, but because survival depends on knowing exactly what food is available and where it's stored. As evening light fades, you observe the cleanup of salting operations. Tables are scrubbed with sand and seawater, barrels are rinsed and stored for next use. Remaining salt is returned to dry storage and sealed against moisture. The work area must be clean not for aesthetic reasons but for practical ones. Spilled salt attracts moisture and can ruin stored supplies. Leftover brine can spoil and contaminate future batches. You settle into evening contemplation, thinking about the sophisticated simplicity of salt preservation. The chemistry is complex: osmotic pressure, bacterial inhibition, protein denaturation, pH changes, but the practice is beautifully simple. Cover food with salt, keep it cool and sealed, wait. The Norse didn't need to understand why it worked. They only needed to know that it did work, and to execute the technique with the precision that generations of experience had refined. Our ancestors never had the gut problems we face today because they peacefully ate these living fermented foods daily. Their digestion was perfectly calm, their skin glowed softly, their bodies aged gracefully. Modern science quietly proves this gut-skin connection our ancestors intuitively understood. These gentle fermentation methods created the same probiotics that kept their bodies and their skin peacefully healthy for decades. If you want to gently get similar benefits while learning these traditional skills, I've found something that quietly bridges that gap using many of the same ingredients our ancestors calmly relied on. Like the fermented fish oils and probiotic cultures they used for gut health and radiant skin. Link, peacefully waiting in the comments. You peacefully observe winter's arrival, when all the autumn preservation work reveals its purpose. Snow falls gently outside the longhouse, in drifts that will soon reach the roofline. Inside, families settle into the rhythm of winter survival, living on food preserved months ago through techniques you've watched with such careful attention. The morning begins in darkness. At this latitude in the heart of winter, sunrise comes late and sunset early, leaving only a few hours of dim daylight between. You watch a woman rise from her sleeping bench, her movements quiet so as not to wake the household too early. The longhouse is cold away from the central hearth, breath visible in the air, frost coating the inside of the turf walls. She stirs the fire first, adding wood to embers that have burned all night. coaxing flame from coals with practiced breath and patience. The fire is life in winter. Warmth, light, cooking, survival. It's never allowed to die completely. Someone always keeping watch, always adding fuel before the last ember fades. You find yourself relaxing into the gentle sounds of fire being rebuilt, wood crackling softly as flames grow. Now she's moving toward the storage areas built into the longhouse walls. You observe as she retrieves provisions for the day's meals, making quiet decisions about what to use and how much. A piece of dried fish from the hanging racks. Some dried mushrooms stored in leather bags. A handful of grain from sealed storage containers. Root vegetables from the earth cellar beneath the floor. Each item represents successful preservation. Autumn work, now sustaining winter life. The dried fish requires preparation. You watch as she places it in a wooden bowl with water, beginning the rehydration process that will make it edible. The fish has transformed so completely during preservation that it barely resembles its original form, stiff as wood, dark and concentrated, almost abstract in appearance. But soaked for hours, it will soften and swell, becoming food again, providing protein and nutrition that keeps bodies warm through cold months. You settle near the hearth, observing as she begins preparing porridge from stored grain. The grain was harvested in late summer, dried carefully, stored in sealed containers where moisture and pests couldn't reach it. Now it's being slowly cooked with water and a pinch of precious salt, transforming into a simple but nourishing meal that will fuel the family through the short winter day. Children are waking now, emerging from sleeping benches wrapped in furs and wool, moving immediately toward the fire's warmth. They're quieter than you might expect. Winter demands a certain calm, a conservation of energy, a peaceful acceptance of the season's limitations. There's no running or shouting, just soft conversations and gentle movements as the household wakes. You watch the family gather for their morning meal. The porridge is served in wooden bowls, simple but sustaining. With it comes small portions of dried fish, rehydrated overnight, and now flaked into edible pieces. There's cultured dairy, skyr that was made in autumn and has been carefully maintained through winter, providing probiotics and protein. The meal is plain by modern standards, but to Norse families it represents success. Preserved food keeping them nourished when nothing fresh exists outside. After breakfast, you observe the daily routine of winter survival. The children have chores even in the cold months, checking the livestock in the attached byre, bringing in firewood from storage, helping to repair tools and equipment. The work happens at a pace that acknowledges the cold, movements measured to conserve body heat, tasks completed with efficiency born from necessity. You notice the longhouse itself is a marvel of winter survival design. The thick turf walls provide insulation that modern houses would envy. The low ceiling traps heat near the floor where people live. The central hearth radiates warmth in all directions while venting smoke through the roof opening. Livestock in the attached byre provide additional heat while being protected from winter's worst. Every aspect of the structure serves preservation, of warmth, of life, of resources. Midday brings the brightest light of the day, though bright is relative in a Nordic winter. You watch as families use this light for detailed work. Women spinning wool, men repairing tools, children learning crafts. The work happens near the fire, hands moving in practiced patterns while conversations flow gently. There's something deeply peaceful about this scene. People making the most of limited resources, working together, surviving through cooperation and skill. You observe the midday meal being prepared, more provisions brought from storage, more rehydration of dried foods, more careful portioning to ensure supplies last. There's a mathematical precision to winter eating that modern people never experience. These families know exactly how much food they have, exactly how long it must last, exactly how much they can eat each day. The calculations are constant and automatic. Every meal a balance between nutrition needed and supplies available. The meal includes items you watched being preserved in autumn: salted meat, soaked to reduce salt content and make it palatable; fermented vegetables, their sharp tang cutting through the monotony of dried foods; barley bread made from grain that was carefully stored. Each bite connects directly to work done months ago, to knowledge passed down through generations, to survival techniques that work because they must work. As afternoon light begins to fade, startlingly early, the darkness of winter returning before the day feels properly lived. You watch families prepare for the long evening ahead. More firewood brought in, lamps filled with seal oil, sleeping furs arranged for warmth. The preparations are automatic, repeated daily, essential for surviving the night's cold. Evening meal is similar to midday. Dried fish, preserved vegetables, simple but nourishing foods that keep bodies warm and strong. You notice they eat slowly, peacefully, making the meal last, enjoying the warmth of the fire and the company of family. There's nowhere to go in winter darkness, nothing to do except tend the fire and rest, so meals become social occasions, times for storytelling and craft work, for being together in the small warm circle that is survival. You observe storytelling beginning as darkness deepens. An elder is telling tales of summers past, of successful hunts, of ancestors who survived even harder winters. The stories aren't just entertainment, they're education, cultural transmission, reassurance that survival is possible because it has always been possible. Children listen with attention that television could never command, their imaginations filling the dark longhouse with the images being created through words alone. Nighttime in the longhouse is a study in peaceful coexistence with darkness and cold. You watch as families arrange themselves for sleep, everyone close to the fire but with clear hierarchies of position. Elders nearest the warmth, children next. Able-bodied adults in the colder positions because they can better withstand it. The sleeping arrangements reflect social structure and practical necessity in equal measure. Someone will keep watch through the night, maintaining the fire, ensuring it never dies. You observe the first watch being taken by a young man who settles near the hearth with wool to spin, work that can be done in firelight while monitoring the flames. His movements are quiet, respectful of those sleeping, competent in their practiced ease. This is his contribution to survival, staying awake so others can rest warm. As you drift deeper into observation of winter night, you understand something profound about Norse survival. It wasn't dramatic or heroic in the way stories suggest. It was this: careful preservation, strict rationing, peaceful coexistence within the limits of what storage provided. The violence and adventure of Viking raids happened precisely because winter at home was so restrictive, so limited, so demanding of patience and quiet endurance. You peacefully observe the quiet crisis management that sustained Norse families when preservation failed or supplies ran shorter than expected. Not every winter went according to plan. Sometimes preservation techniques failed. Sometimes winter lasted longer than supplies were calculated for. Sometimes unexpected mouths needed feeding. You're watching now how families manage these challenges with calm competence rather than panic. The morning brings news that a storage pit has been compromised. Melting snow seeped in despite careful construction, and some root vegetables have begun to spoil. You watch as families gather to assess the damage with practical eyes, no recrimination or blame. Just immediate movement to salvage what can be saved and redistribute what must be shared. An elder woman is sorting through the affected vegetables with swift, sure movements. Some are entirely spoiled and must be discarded. Composted for next year's garden, nothing wasted even in loss. Others are partially damaged and can be trimmed, cooked immediately, consumed before spoilage spreads. Still others are fine, merely exposed to moisture but not yet affected. Her sorting creates 3 piles that reflect 3 different responses to the same crisis. You observe the immediate redistribution of salvaged food. Families gather, and the edible but compromised vegetables are allocated fairly for immediate consumption. No family gets more than their share based on size and need. No one tries to hoard or claim extra. The social contract of survival is being honored automatically. Crisis reveals community rather than destroying it. Now you watch as families adjust their consumption plans. If a storage pit failed, other sources must compensate. More dried fish will be eaten to replace the lost root vegetables. Stored grain will be used more liberally. The calculations happen quickly in experienced minds. No written records needed. Just the mental accounting of people who track their supplies with survival-dependent attention. You notice they're implementing hunger management strategies that modern people rarely experience. Meals are being stretched with more porridge, more filling but less nutritious grains, replacing some of the lost vegetables. The adjustment is subtle, not starvation, not deprivation that threatens health, just strategic reduction that makes supplies last longer. Stomachs won't be quite as full, but bodies will still be nourished adequately. There's a particular plant being gathered now, even in winter's cold. You watch as children accompany adults to areas where pine trees grow, collecting pine bark carefully without killing the trees. The inner bark, scraped free and dried, can be ground into flour that extends grain supplies. It's not delicious, not preferred, but it's edible and nutritious, and the Norse know exactly when and how to use this emergency food source. The bark processing is happening with calm efficiency. You observe as it's scraped clean of outer bark, the inner layer exposed and peeling away in strips that will be dried near the fire. Once dry, it can be ground into powder that mixes with grain flour, creating bread that's rougher and less tasty, but adequately nutritious and significantly more filling than grain alone. You find yourself mesmerized by the knowledge being applied here. These people know which trees can be safely harvested, how much bark can be taken without killing the tree, which layers are edible and which are not. This is famine food, yes, but it's famine food that works, that has saved families through countless difficult winters, that represents generations of experimentation and knowledge sharing. Nearby, fishing through ice is happening despite the cold. You watch as men drill through lake ice, creating holes where fishing lines can be dropped. The work is brutal in winter wind, hands going numb even with fur mittens. But the possibility of fresh protein drives the effort. Ice fishing was planned for, but now it's being pursued more aggressively to compensate for the lost storage. The fishing is patient work. You observe a man sitting beside his ice hole, line in hand, watching for the subtle tug that indicates a fish below. His posture is relaxed despite the cold, body positioned to conserve heat, movements minimal to avoid unnecessary energy expenditure. When a fish bites, his response is swift and practiced. Pull it up, remove it from the hook, rebait, drop the line again. No celebration, no drama, just quiet competence in emergency food gathering. Fresh fish in winter is being treated differently than fresh fish in autumn. You watch as it's divided immediately among families based on need. Those with the least stored food receiving larger shares, those with adequate stores receiving less. The distribution is fair rather than equal, reflecting the communal survival ethic that prevents anyone from starving while others have plenty. These forgotten Norse fermentation methods didn't just prevent scurvy and malnutrition. They quietly created the beneficial gut bacteria that kept Vikings' digestion perfectly calm, their skin glowing softly even through harsh winters, their bodies aging gracefully. Modern science peacefully confirms this gut-skin connection our ancestors lived by. While you're learning these traditional preservation skills, there's a modern solution gently based on these same ancient principles. Using ingredients like the fermented fish oils and probiotic cultures, Norse peoples valued for gut health and radiant skin. Rest easy knowing the link is peacefully waiting in the description below. So rest now, quiet traveler through ancient preservation techniques. Let these gentle stories of fermentation and drying, of salting and smoking, of community bonds and seasonal rhythms, drift away with your thoughts into peaceful sleep. And perhaps if you listen very closely to the night settling around you, you'll hear the distant echoes of those Norse settlements. Smokehouses glowing in autumn darkness, families working together with quiet confidence, the patient sounds of preservation that meant survival in the harshest climate humans ever called home. Sleep well and dream of wood smoke and fermentation, of salt rubbed into fish with practiced hands, of communities that understood survival as something shared rather than competed for. Dream of that ancient wisdom that modern convenience has let us forget, but which waits patiently, like a preserved fish in a sealed barrel, ready to nourish us again if we remember to seek it. Good night.